You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. During the 2023 summer movie season, there was a surprise hit at the global box office, Oppenheimer. Directed by Christopher Nolan, the biopic chronicled the life of University of California, Berkeley professor J. Robert Oppenheimer, and it dramatized how he and a team of physicists invented and tested the world's first nuclear bomb at Los Alamos, New Mexico in July of 1945.
Are we saying there's a chance that when we push that button, we destroy the world?
Chances are near zero.
Near zero.
What do you want for theory alone?
Zero would be nice.
The film has gone on to earn almost $1 billion worldwide, and part of its success surely stems from the anxiety many feel about the state of nuclear weapons. Nuclear war would bring a new, horrifying era to mankind, if many people even survived it. For generations, a nuclear war has been assumed to be so horrible that no one has used these weapons since 1945. But what have we done in the last 80 years to pull ourselves back from the edge of nuclear destruction? In her new book, Nuclear War, A Scenario, Pulitzer-Prize finalist Annie Jacobsen explores a ticking clock scenario. Based on dozens of exclusive interviews with military and civilian experts who've built the weapons, she pieced together what a response to nuclear war might look like. Annie Jacobsen spoke in front of a live audience at Commonwealth Club World Affairs in March. She was in conversation with independent tech journalist and former head of editorial at Google Cloud, Quentin Hardy.
Discussing the career of Robert Oppenheimer and the gathering of several hundred of the world's most brilliant people at Los Alamos in the mid-1940s to develop the atomic bomb, the physicist Freeman Dyson described it as a Faustian bargain, in which theoretical physicists were given the opportunity to make their ideas and their theories into a concrete reality through the almost unlimited economic resources of the world's greatest economic power. In exchange, they were compelled by this bargain to turn over their results to the world's greatest military power, also supported by the U.S. economy. As a result of that devil's bargain, as we speak today, thousands of people are standing by to commit global genocide on command. That was our deal with the devil. We've been living with it for almost 8 decades, 24/7, every minute, thousands of people standing by, committed to total nuclear warfare if the necessity occurs. The prospect was first among 2 nuclear powers and now among many, many nuclear belligerents, a number that seems to be growing inexorably. Now, most of us have some dim understanding of that destructive potential. We hear about the presidential football with the missile launch codes, or with the silos of devastating rockets in North Dakota, across our prairies, planes and submarines flying nonstop, seeking, protecting, deterring. What very few of us know is what an elaborate and terrifying system of global destruction the United States has built and improved upon for 8 decades. In Nuclear War, A Scenario, Annie Jacobsen takes us through this little-known and critical system of deterrence, and failing deterrence, global annihilation. It is a shocking and fascinating read, and upon publication, an essential text in any discussion of where this Faustian bargain has taken us and what the United States might do in the future. Annie Jacobsen, welcome to the Commonwealth Club.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, let's begin by talking a little bit what led you to this book, and perhaps in particular the character of John H. Rubel.
So, as a national security reporter and investigative journalist, I write about war and weapons, national security and secrets. 6 previous books. Imagine the number of my sources, 100 per book. And how many of those individuals said to me with a kind of prideful chest swelling, "Oh, my life's work was dedicated to preventing nuclear World War III." And during the last administration, the fire and fury rhetoric of it all, I got to thinking, what would happen if deterrence failed? What would happen if prevention failed? And I took that question to the highest level, upper echelon national security sources that I had and others. And I asked them exactly that. And that was the impetus for this book. And of course, John Rubel was a rare individual, now deceased, who left behind a memoir that gave a tiny glimmer of what a nuclear war plan would actually be like, because those are jealously guarded secrets within the United States government. And I was able to springboard that into a whole lot of other questions.
And of course, in the present moment, it involves satellites and other players that Mr. Rubel never envisioned being part of the system. The system has grown and grown and grown. You don't take apart older parts, you just build up on them. Well, the warheads have cut down somewhat, but they're still utterly lethal. Your conclusion seems to be you fling one, another one will get flung, and the system will just almost feed on itself, correct?
That was one of the first of many jaw-dropping realizations reporting this book, was that nuclear war is a system of systems. It is built upon this idea that deterrence will hold. And to have found, as I did, the Deputy General of Stratcom saying to a group of insiders on the record, if deterrence fails, it all unravels. And that unraveling is what I portray in nuclear war scenario. It's one by one by one. And I'm talking about seconds and minutes of action, not days and weeks. That was really what got me immediately thinking about how to frame the book and how to report it as the ticking clock scenario that it is. As you know, it's 3 acts. In 72 minutes, it's over.
Ah, you went to the spoiler. It's in the intro, and that's
Right.
the shocking thing.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, the aftermath is a nuclear winter and radioactive drift, but undoing perhaps 50,000 years of human civilization in, 72 minutes?
72 minutes is sort of when all the last weapons land on the United States.
Yes, and
Essentially, that's where recorded history ends.
yeah, there's no telling how anything could happen after that, because, as you state, even nuclear winter was only thought about 30 years after the fact. No one knows what the real knock-on effect of several thermonuclear weapons going off at the same time might be. And yet, you spend many pages on those effects, but far more on the bureaucracy itself. And you acknowledge interviews with dozens, scores of people involved in the system. 2 questions. One, as best we understand it, how many other countries have systems like this?
Well, of course, as you said in your intro, this all began with 2 superpowers, the United States and then Soviet Russia. The system was set up to sort of have both sides pointing their guns, pointing their missiles at one another, with the idea of deterrence being, don't you dare launch, or else we will all die. And that's how we get MAD, mutual assured destruction. But as you correctly point out, things have changed, and there are now 9 nuclear-armed nations.
That we know of.
Well, I would be relatively certain that that's what it is right now. I mean, there are an enormous number of people, very capable people working on these issues in non-proliferation, keeping track of things. I always remember to mention the Federation of American Scientists. They have a team that puts together the nuclear notebook. And so they keep track of the warheads, which, because of treaties, get reported. There is, of course, an exception, and the exception is North Korea, the incredibly dangerous nuclear-armed nation. And that is, of course, why I chose to thread North Korea into the scenario the way in which I did.
Yes, in the context of mutually assured destruction, it's built on game theory and rational actors. And at this point, those systems don't really hold, because a game with 9 different players and 9 different agendas is problematic. And if one of them is a history of highly unpredictable behavior, it's hard to say that it is a very durable system.
That's right. I mean, it's the Mad King logic that really frightens most people in the U.S. nuclear command and control system. And I was surprised just how forthcoming a number of individuals were with how tenuous the situation is with North Korea. And I'm talking about former secretaries of defense, by example. I'm talking about, former FEMA directors who would be in charge of nuclear war should it happen. That is the protection planning of the population, which is another absurd concept we can get into. I mean, it's just one shocking situation after the next.
I was rather shocked that you have this FEMA document that says you can protect your family from a nuclear explosion. And I looked it up. It was published in 2019. This isn't some comical 1960s duck and cover fantasy.
You're absolutely right. And if you look, and of course I reproduce that in the book because it contradicts itself in every measure. And that is one of the most horrifying things about nuclear war, is that there is no way to survive a nuclear war. It no matter how it starts, it only escalates toward nuclear Armageddon. And so all of the things that are said in that single sheet, kind of a tear sheet of what to do in the event of a nuclear war, are absurd because it could perhaps save you in one situation and kill you in another situation. Go into your basement or don't go into your basement. Well, it depends where that blast is when you are in your basement. And these, of course, are the details that I take the reader through with, I think, horrific specificity, but important specificity, because the point of all this is to demonstrate that the time to have conversations about all of this is now, not later. Later is too late.
Well, as a reader, I can assure you, specific, horrific, you checked both boxes. Don't worry. Let me ask you, as a reader, I'm with it for a few hours. As a writer, you're with it for a year. What's it like to be in this bureaucracy and spend 20 or 30 years inside planning or actually acting in nuclear war scenarios? What's it like to spend your life dedicated to a group of missile silos or bases or hidden command centers across the American prairie?
Well, I talk to a lot of people, and a lot of the, missileers, yes, but really people that are in charge of the policy, people that are in charge of advising the president in the moments after detection that a nuclear missile has come at the United States, because that's really what we're talking about here in a scenario. It's the fact that an intercontinental ballistic missile, and by the way, most people do not know this, an intercontinental ballistic missile, also known as an ICBM, takes just 30 minutes to get from one side of the world to the next. And so the clock begins ticking then, and the president must make a decision to counterattack with nuclear missiles.
Just to amplify, it's a 30-minute trip, but an American satellite has registered it less than a second into its journey, setting in a concatenation across space and the American continent.
You're absolutely right. And so it's like you reverse engineer from that concept of the 30-minute missile to realize this is why the system is set up. We have these incredible satellite systems in space called SBIRS, space-based infrared satellite systems. They're astonishing with their technology. Think about it. They can detect the hot rocket exhaust on an ICBM launch from any enemy armed nation within a fraction of a second. This is remarkable. And this is so that the president can launch his counterattack in minutes afterward. And that's where you begin to realize, I think, certainly you asked me about the reporting of it, right? All of the people behind the scenes that are rehearsing this 24/7, 365 are acutely aware that deterrence is terrific if it holds. Their job is relatively simple. It is just rehearsing what might happen. But if nuclear war begins, it becomes a sequence of events. A follows B. There is no divergent from that pathway to apocalypse. And that is what is so appalling and remarkable, and also worthy of everybody understanding, particularly as we enter into this present time of nuclear saber rattling, which astonishes me every day.
I was also seeking to understand the mental state of the people who are in this. Are they proud? Are they terrified? Do they feel like they've been in something kind of devilish and lunatic or something noble? All of the above?
In my experience as a reporter, many of my sources are in their 80s and 90s. And this is because I believe that as one gets older, this has certainly been my experience, and you have been involved in a very long career that you just pointed to, and we're talking about the emotional part of it here, and that I spoke of in my opening thoughts on this, having to do with reflecting back about where we are, about a person in their 80s that has been dedicated to the national security apparatus their whole life, who thought, oh, we had it covered when the wall went down.
Right.
And so to answer your question, I got very emotional. People were very emotional with me in speaking. I mean, former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, now I think he's 85. I mean, has dedicated his life to public service. Former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, now in his 90s. Both of these individuals said to me that that what I was doing was important to them. Panetta even said the American public needs to know. What an interesting idea that people have gone from, oh, we've got this covered, trust us, to, wait a minute, wake up and pay attention. Something's got to change or something very bad will happen.
I mean, that is the shocking thing in some ways, that people don't know. They could to some extent. Do you think it's just too horrific for most of us to contemplate, or the larger part of the government would prefer we didn't dwell on this?
You know, that is a great question. And I think it has to do with access. And I think it has to do with the word openness comes to mind, or transparency, or ease of understanding. Nuclear weapons have long been relegated to the PhD fancy crowd with bow ties. And I have interviewed many of them. And I wrote Nuclear War, a Scenario, to read like fiction. It is nonfiction. It has been called dystopian nonfiction. I wanted it to be easy to read, like all of my books. I write for the layman. I write for the regular people. It doesn't mean I'm not read by the generals at the Pentagon or the very smart PhDs in a university. But really, my heart and soul is with the average person who wants to understand a little bit more, a little bit easier about these concepts, which can seem very intimidating.
I spoke at the beginning about Los Alamos and the ironic nature of brilliant people being so caught up with their ideas that they're perhaps not really thinking through the consequences of what permanently endowing a military with these might mean. And you illustrate that very well on a kind of mass and bureaucratic basis when you talk about some of the scenario planning. The 1960 prediction that 275 million people will be killed in the first hour across Russia in a nuclear strike. And I'll quote you. The Pentagon had paid 1,300 people to compile a war plan that would kill 1/5 of the people on Earth in a preemptive first strike. Does anybody involved in that process understand just how crazy all that is? Or are they just caught up in the act of doing it?
And we know from that section that you're referring to, which I kind of give the reader the how did we get here, build up to when the scenario begins in the first fraction of the second that the missile is detected. But to your point, I think that it's important to know and to realize that once upon a time, not that long ago in the 1950s, the admirals and generals who were doing this planning, the nuclear war plans, They believed that nuclear war could be fought and won. They would, of course, have the bunkers to go into, which we now know won't even be able to withstand multiple warheads. But at the time, there was this sort of mad, ignorant folly or determined, it is true because I say so attitude by these generals and admirals. I certainly read between the lines when I read those declassified documents. And yet, that's the legacy we're all left with.
Like any good consultant, they sell this illusion about certainty that, okay, 275 million people will die. If you're off by 2%, that's 5.5 million people. What?
I mean, it truly is madness. And yet, so now the policy is not fighting and winning nuclear war. It's don't have a nuclear war no matter what. But as I begin to point out in the book, once the scenario really gets going, is that the world is just one misunderstanding, one technical mistake away from nuclear Armageddon. Because once the missiles start flying, and again, SecDef's confirmed this with me, no one is really thinking about what the other nuclear armed nations are thinking as America tries to defend herself in a nuclear counterattack against a rogue nation. And you have all kinds of technical problems revealed in my reporting that I relay in the book that also really make your hair stand on end. I mean, one of them, for example, is, of course, the fact that Russia, because Russia alleges to have all the same technology that America has, so Russia's Tundra system is the name of its early warning space satellite system. And multiple defense scientists, both in the United States and Russian-born defense scientists, told me, and I reported in the book, that the Tundra system is deeply flawed. The best, worst example is that the system can mistake sunlight for hot rocket exhaust on a missile. And so the Tundra system could perceive sunlight as a launch and launch in response.
Yes, and quality of communication varies, and people trust different communication. One of the interesting dimensions in your scenario is, quite plausibly, the Russians have a spy somewhere near a missile silo in Wyoming, and he notifies Moscow a missile has left the silo. They're going to just act on that. They're not going to listen to anything Washington is saying, most likely. But let's move into the scenario, because what you describe is a very plausible communications breakdown. Let's move to the scenario and how it unfolds.
Well, of course, the detection of the nuclear missile is second number one, and things move very quickly thereafter, because what most people don't realize is that the data systems are so fast that they pump data from space to 3 command bunkers in the United States in seconds. And these 3 bunkers are famously the one in Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. It's made many appearances in movies. There's also one beneath the Pentagon. It's called the National Military Command Center. And there's a third bunker beneath STRATCOM, U.S. Strategic Command, the most powerful nuclear agency that almost no one has heard of. The way it was described to me about these 3 command bunkers was like this. The Cheyenne Mountain Complex is the brain. The National Command Center beneath the Pentagon is the beating heart of nuclear war, and STRATCOM is the muscle. And those 3 centers, the commanders at each of those facilities, within minutes of detecting a nuclear launch, now begins to categorize the missiles and the targets that will be in the continental United States and prepares to tell the president. And when the president begins to have to make a counterattack decision, as I report in the book, and was also surprised to learn, the president has a 6-minute window. And listeners may ask, well, how does she, know all these things? Are these from Annie Jacobsen's imagination? Everything is sourced in the book. If you go into the notes, you can see where the information comes from. Sometimes I quote people directly, but for example, the 6-minute window to make a decision about launching nuclear Armageddon comes from Ronald Reagan's memoir.
Mm-hmm. And it's 6 minutes in which, they find him wherever he might be. In this case, he's in the White House and not wherever else he might be. And he is hustled from one room to another, and he's given the football, and it's go time, and he's trying to figure out what happens next. And meanwhile, the missile is flying. Take it from there.
Well, to report that part of the book, I wondered, well, what would happen with the president, knowing about the Secret Service as I do, having written about the Secret Service in other books. And so I interviewed Secret Service agents, a former director of the Secret Service, members of the CAT team, which is the counter assault team, the president's paramilitary team, to learn that while the military is now in this 6-minute window intent on getting launch orders from the president, the Secret Service team is intent on doing their job, which is very different. Their job is to save the life of the president of the United States, to protect his life no matter what. And so what they want to do is in conflict with what the military wants. And I relay that in the book, how that would unfold. And ultimately, Secret Service says they would win that debate. They would whisk the president off in a helicopter and take him off to the bunker outside of Washington, D.C., colloquially known as Raven Rock, but officially known as the alternate National Military Command Center beneath the Pentagon, because almost everyone in Washington, D.C. knows Washington is a top target in what's called a bolt out of the blue attack. And so all systems are set up to have an alternate command center underneath the Raven Rock bunker.
Just for viewer context, 6 minutes is, we've been talking for 5 times as long as that 6 minutes. It's an exceptionally short amount of time. And let's move to the targets, because you choose 2 very interesting targets here that have extremely different consequences.
Yes. So we have the 1 megaton thermonuclear bomb now heading toward Washington, D.C. in the beginning of the unfolding of the war that is immediately detected. And then we have a sneak attack by a submarine-launched ballistic missile on the west coast of the United States. And I did this with very calculated reasons, having discussed the worst case scenarios with national security experts who sit around and worry about these things with good reason. And of course, the technical aspects of it are all sourced through engineers and weapons designers. And we do know that North Korea does have this capability. I mean, some people say it might not be something that could actually happen, and others are convinced it could happen, meaning that North Korea could get a submarine up to the West Coast. By the way, Russia and China do regularly. And I show a document in the book that I found on a budget request for the Defense Department where they demonstrate exactly that. And so the second target is a nuclear power plant in California. And, you know, when I was writing the book, this was a hypothetical situation. It's called Rule 42 of the Geneva Conventions, Article 15, which says you never strike a nuclear power plant in war. And so I was thinking about a rogue nation going way outside normative behavior and doing that. And then, of course, during the Ukraine war, when we began to see repeatedly Russia using regular kinetic weapons against the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, this fear moved from an imaginary hypothetical scenario to a very real threat.
Yes, that was 2 years ago, not even.
And that facility has lost power 8 or 9 times now due to warfare in the vicinity. And that kind of horror is something that the Japanese call the devil's scenario, because they almost experienced it after the tidal wave.
Fukushima. Yeah. It's 6 extremely fraught minutes, not just inherently, but while it's in flight, it's unclear whether it will hit New York or Washington, and the president may need to leave. And now there's this threat on Diablo Canyon in California. What does the White House decide to do next, and how does that go?
That was a really interesting series of reporting and a series of conversations that I did with sources to discern in the scenario what would happen. There's a quote from General Hyten, who was Stratcom commander during the Fire and Fury rhetoric. Barbara Starr of CNN interviewed him and asked him what would happen. And he said, if North Korea needs to know that if they send one nuclear missile, we send one. If they send two, we send two. And I sourced that in the book. But taking this question to national security experts, including Bruce Blair, now deceased, but who is pretty much the world's expert on the kind of command and control systems and responses. According to Blair, if North Korea launched one nuclear weapon at the United States, the response would almost certainly be 82 nuclear weapons in response in order to take out North Korea's nuclear command and control. And so that is what happens in the scenario. And then I explain how another jaw-dropping moment, learning in my reporting that America sends ICBMs out of our silos in the Midwest that you referred to in the opening statement that make up 50 of those 82 warheads that will now target North Korea. But what I learned is American ICBMs do not have enough range to fly directly to North Korea without overflying Russia. And that is a disaster waiting to happen. Imagine two nations in as much conflict as Russia and the United States are right now, and America wanting Russia to assume that 50 nuclear warheads are just going to fly over their country. They are not going to hit the country. That becomes an apocalyptic situation.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, Annie Jacobsen on the nuclear threats of Russia and North Korea, and whether we have reason for concern. If you missed any part of this episode, or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. If you're just joining us, we're sharing a conversation between journalist Annie Jacobsen and tech reporter Quentin Hardy. They spoke about her new book, Nuclear War, a Scenario, in front of a live audience at Commonwealth Club World Affairs in March.
And of course, underneath this, there is still this engine of diplomacy/bureaucracy. And it's imperative that in this 6 minutes, in addition to authorizing a nuclear war, someone has to tell the Russians, hey, it's not you, we're just going for Pyongyang here. But how does that work out in your scenario?
You know, another fantasy is that there are these communication systems that work flawlessly. That is just simply not true. And the best example I could report was early on in the Ukraine-Russia war. It was in November of 2022. Listeners may recall what turned out to be an erroneous report of a Russian missile striking Poland. And so that is a NATO country. That is an Article 5 situation. It's a very, very dangerous potential situation. Nonetheless, it took General Milley, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, more than 36 hours to give a press conference admitting that he had been yet unable to reach his Russian counterpart. Mm-hmm. When we consider that nuclear war happens in seconds and minutes, the idea of 36 hours to get in touch with Russia, it's been endgame by then.
And in your context, this is while the president has realized they are targeting Washington and flees in the Marine helicopter for a supposed safe location.
That's right.
Unfortunately.
Oh, come on, we can't give everything away.
Okay. Unfortunately, communications break down further. We'll put it that way. And at some point, the Russians do just jump in because it's use them or lose them as far as they're concerned.
And that's sort of a crazy sentence that exists in the nuclear command and control nomenclature. Use them or lose them. Thank you for remembering that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And here's another one that sounds Orwellian. Escalate to de-escalate. I mean, what does that even mean? Oh, what that
Bomb
means,
to save.
right? What that means is, kill to live. It is really, and of course, this is all happening so quickly that everything unravels exactly like that Stratcom commander said it would.
And it is, in addition to being a somewhat cockamamie system or a more fragile system than many would like to admit, it is durable in many other ways. And one of our viewers asked earlier, what happens to submarines with weapons or the bunkers or the nuclear plane after the nuclear war begins to commence, or even before? They are in play on many levels as well.
That's right. I mean, the submarines, they're not called the handmaidens of the apocalypse for nothing. The United States has 14 Ohio-class nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered submarines, and they're technically what are called second strike, which means even if an enemy were to take out all of our missile silos, those submarines are undetectable. They are going around the oceans, not all 14 at the same time, but a good many of them. And the shocking part is that they take just 14 minutes to launch from the presidential order. The ICBMs take even less, 60 seconds. One of the common quips is they don't call them Minutemen for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But these submarines have, 90 some odd warheads on them, and they can take out an entire nation. And so the idea of redundancy is a concept that is built into nuclear command and control. But a synonym for that is absurdity, because at a point, to the listener's question, what point is too much? Yes, the submarines would most likely continue to move around under the oceans after the world has been annihilated.
Just as Russia and China are patrolling our coasts, they're patrolling the coasts of those nations and many others. You spend a lot of time in the book talking about the realities of the blast center, the fires, the radiation. And I think it would be useful to touch on that now, both on land in Washington, D.C., and then in the destructive power of a single submarine. Mm-hmm. What does one blast look like, and how much firepower is there in one of these submarines? You mentioned 14 warheads. What does that mean?
The center point of a thermonuclear weapon is 180 million degree blast of light. It is so incomprehensible, that kind of temperature, and everything incinerated. Everything is incinerated. People turn into combusting carbon with a 1 megaton thermonuclear bomb. That's a full mile radius of fire. And I describe in the book what happens to people in the rings going out in sort of 5-10 mile increments. And again, this is not Annie Jacobsen's imagination. These are sourced from Defense Department documents that have been compiled based on the effects, starting with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs in 1945, and then becoming expanded and elaborated during the 50s when the U.S. was doing atmospheric weapons testing, both in Nevada and in the Pacific Ocean, compiling nuclear effects on people and on things. And to answer your question about the power of the submarine used to have 24 launch tubes. Now it has 20. So you can think about these 20 Trident missiles. Each one is MIRVed. I mean, this is such nuclear geekdom, but it's there in the book for everyone to know about because your trillions of dollars have paid for them.
And MIRV stands for?
Multiple Independently Targetable Reentry Vehicle. It means that, it's so much technology. And interestingly, this technology is decades old, by the way. But a MIRVed warhead was meant to sort of trick any interceptor missile that might try to take it out, because the warhead releases, and then the multiple warheads inside the nose cone release and are able to travel independently to these different targets.
Not multiple warheads, multiple nuclear bombs.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. So
That's right.
not 20 tubes in which there are each multiple nuclear
Yes.
bombs. How many
Yes.
nuclear bombs in total in a typical submarine?
About 90. 90.
Okay. Yeah. Each one probably more powerful than Hiroshima.
Oh my God.
Keep
Each
going.
one, I mean, you can really geek out on the numbers, right? Because it changes. But let's say a 300 kiloton warhead or a 400 kiloton warhead. Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. Think about the order of magnitude on that.
We counterattack on North Korea. The Russians let go their full fire and fury. We then do what we're trained to do if the Russians attack, correct? There
right.
is no stop. Nobody scales back at that point, right? There is no rational system in which they go, hold on, everybody, just take a day, right? They just go.
And let's stop for a minute to discuss, if we may, how such things are known, right? Because again, as I mentioned, nuclear war plans are jealously guarded secrets. I refer to a rare declassified war game from 1983 called Proud Prophet. And I reprint a couple pages of the Proud Prophet war game in the book. And people might laugh or cry when they read it because they think they will realize this is what a redacted war game looks like. I mean, it's 95% black. There's just a few words per page. But what the declassification of that war game did was allow a certain professor from Yale named Paul Bracken, who had participated in it, to speak generally about that war game without violating his security clearance. And what he said was this. He said, no matter how nuclear war begins, whether it involves NATO or doesn't involve NATO, whether it involves tactical weapons or doesn't involve tactical weapons, if China gets involved or China doesn't get involved, no matter what, it ends in total apocalypse. And that is most definitely something that people should take note of.
Yes. Not to give too much away, but essentially the world ends.
The world does end, and then we have nuclear winter.
Well, that's an interesting note, in fact, because the war is largely in the Northern Hemisphere. China may get involved in this. It's quite likely they might. But essentially, India, Africa, South America, Australia, Pacific Islands, they're not directly affected. Doesn't really matter, does it?
By the bombs, they're not affected, right? But what happens, there's a secondary effect. First, there's the light. Then there's the blast. Then there's the wind destroying, pushing several 100-mile-an-hour winds, just destroying everything moving out from ground zero. And then there are what are called megafires. So strong with hurricane force winds, they end up making their own weather. These are 100-square-mile areas of megafire. And imagine that times 1,000. And imagine that in the United States, in North Korea, and in Russia. And then imagine 330 billion pounds of soot being lofted into the troposphere, because that's what climate modeling shows us will happen. And so, yes, to answer your question, a lot of other nations are not involved in the nuclear war whatsoever. They didn't start it. They don't have nuclear weapons. They weren't involved. But this is where calculations now tell us that 5 billion people will die.
It seems like, you can forget about civilization surviving. Life will go on because life is extremely persistent, but humans would probably not be the dominant species again for a very, very long time.
That's absolutely right. And, in my interviews with former FEMA director Craig Fugate, he talked about how FEMA prepares for asteroid strikes. They prepare for nuclear war. These are called low probability, high consequence events. And so when you think about it, Nuclear war is the only event other than an asteroid strike that could end the world, could end civilization in a few hours. You really have to wonder, why aren't more people working to solve this problem? Because we really do exist on the razor's edge right now.
Someone asks, what about AI? Do you see AI coming into this system, and would that be a new unknown unknown?
So many of the nuclear war command and control systems are analog, right? So, for example, all the missiles are, and people are shocked when they hear that.
Yeah.
As you can read in the book, the sub-launched ballistic missiles are guided not by high technology, but by star sighting, the ancient form of navigation. And this is to keep them from being hacked. I interviewed General Toohill, America's first cyber chief during the Obama administration. And cyber certainly has an interesting role in our society in terms of threats, but right now it is distinctly in a separate lane from nuclear command and control.
So let's turn to what might be done, because you hint in various places in the book, it doesn't have to be like this. Steps could be taken. What is the realistic other scenario in which we're not looking at this scenario?
The hopeful part of it, I think, goes like this, right? So when I was a young high school student, there was a television miniseries called The Day After. And it portrayed a fictional version of nuclear war between the United States and then Soviet Russia. And, you know, the ABC executives were encouraged not to air it because it was so horrific. And they aired it anyways. And people got very upset. 100 million people watched that miniseries, me, but also a very important person, President Ronald Reagan. And he wrote in his memoirs, in his journal as president, that he was greatly depressed, his words. And remember, before this, Reagan was all about nuclear supremacy. He believed in the arms race. He was part of it. And after seeing The Day After, he came to a different conclusion. It's called the Reagan reversal among insiders. He reached out to President Gorbachev, and through a series of communications known as the Reykjavik Summit in Iceland, they agreed that nuclear war was madness. And because of their talks, the world went from the all-time high of nuclear weapons was 70,000 in 1986, 70,000. Today, we have 12,500. And so you might say that's 12,500 too many, but it's certainly a step in the right direction.
It's in the right direction. Absolutely. Unfortunately, it also gave us the concept of Star Wars and a perfect shield against nuclear weapons. Several $1 trillion later, or however much they've spent, how effective is that nuclear shield?
You know, the way I read that situation is Reagan really backed down off of that because of how he felt after seeing The Day After. At least that is the interpretation of, if you look at the timeline. He was very pro SDI before that. You know, the problem with trying to intercept nuclear missiles, whether it's from the ground or from space, is that it doesn't work. You know, very early on in the scenario, I describe what happens when one of our 44 interceptor missile tries to go up against an incoming missile. I was at a dinner party 2, 3, 4 years ago, and I mentioned that I was working on this book. And someone said to me, "Oh, Annie, we have interceptor missiles like the Iron Dome." You know, I didn't want to tell them they were wrong. I figured I'm going to wait and let them read the book. But that is a fantasy. We have 44 interceptor missiles. Russia alone has 1,670 missiles on ready for launch status. We have approximately the same. We actually have a little bit more. And so how are 44 missiles? And by the way, they have a shoot down rate of between 40 and 50% only. How are 44 missiles going to go up against the mother load of 1,000 or more nuclear weapons?
And we just got a late ad question that's pertinent to this.
Okay.
In the case of a nuclear war, does every country with nuclear weapons launch? Does China jump in? Does Britain jump in? Does France jump in? Does India jump in?
And that is the question that might have to be in nuclear war scenario part 2. And I don't say that in jest, because I think the real point that I was trying to make by ending at 74 minutes, and when all the electricity goes out from the nuclear EMP, you won't know. How would you know?
Right. It's just darkness on every sense. So could be, depends on how they game it. Pakistan and India are facing each other off, and this has already happened. Who knows?
The former commander of STRATCOM, General Keeler, when he and I were discussing this, and we were discussing Russia, US, and the nuclear arsenals that they have, and were they to get into a conflict, he said to me, and this is a quote, "The world could end in the next couple of hours."
Absolutely. There might be some healing, but the damage would be...
Which is why I have a coda in the book that is 24,000 years later, after doing these 24-minute acts. And there's this incredible archaeological site, now a UNESCO site, in southern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. And I interviewed one of the 2 archaeologists who were there that day in 1993 when it was discovered. And it's from 12,000 years ago. And it was a lost civilization until 1993. And it's rewriting history's timeline in terms of man, in terms of science, in terms of civilization, because it was a society of hunter-gatherers. And yet they built this incredible facility. We don't know if it was a temple. You can see photographs in the book. You can see them online, Göbekli Tepe. But it really got me thinking, looking at those photographs, to your point about this idea that man has evolved over tens of thousands of years, very rapidly recently, to the point where we have actually created a technology, a system of technology that can kill us in a matter of hours. And it reminded me of the Einstein quote where he was said to have been asked about nuclear war. And he said, "I don't know what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones."
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by the Commonwealth Club Programs team. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.